to Dr. Nao Gamo and Dr. Idong, who are our guests for today's session. And I would like you to please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nao Gamo. It's very nice to meet you all. I am founder and CEO of NaoCorp LLC. It is a grant consulting business where I work with entrepreneurs, researchers, and clinicians to help them win grant funding for biotech and medtech companies. And I especially work with a lot of early stage startups. So I've done a lot of SBIRs and STTRs in addition to other types of research grants. I also have a few roles to support the development of new medtech and biotech ventures. I am Vice President of Business Development at the MDC Studio, which is a startup studio building health and medtech companies from very early stages. I'm also an associate at the Verte family of funds, which is a group of venture funds investing in high growth companies located in opportunity zones. Back in my previous life, I spent many years as an academic researcher in neuroscience. So I actually have my PhD in neurobiology and did my postdoc in psychiatry. I'm also the former founder and CEO of Neurosonics Medical, where we're developing a therapeutic ultrasound device to make brain surgery less invasive.
Thank you, Nao. Idong?
Yeah, so Nao is a hard act to follow. So I'm Dr. Idong Essiet-Gibson. So I am principal of the Idyeas Group, where we work with life science and health founders with accessing non-dilutive funding, helping them with strategy, and also engaging with them beyond other like access to equity funding as well. So a couple of things. So with the business focused on working with startups, incubators and accelerators, and really working with their portfolio companies to help them figure out what the best sources are and how to best position themselves to be competitive for funding. I also am part of an angel group that has made, it's actually a sector agnostic angel group. It's a female focused group headquartered out of Colorado, made a couple of investments, but more recently I've been making more investments in the medtech space because I've recently gone into the role of serving as deal lead, helping them with sourcing deals and also helping with the due diligence process. So it's been quite the experience working with startup founders and now looking at it from an investor perspective. And I also am active in our DMV ecosystem, done some work as a mentor and judging events for TEDCO, for the Maryland Tech Council's VMS program, and I think it's called CAI out of DC. So that's Idong. Oh, and background. So I have a PhD in public health, but undergrad biochemistry. So I started out biomedical research and then got into public health program management, 20 plus years in the federal government. So done a couple of agencies, the NIH, the CDC, the Office of the Secretary, BARDA, and a couple of other agencies. So my background has been a mix of going from biomedical research to public health program management, and then now sitting on this side in an advisory role to companies in the space. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to an engaging conversation.
Excellent. I did not know your background was in biochemistry. My PhD is in biochemistry as well. So let's get into today's conversation. Let's start with the elephant in the room. We know with all the changes that are happening at the federal level, what should startups be aware of with respect to grant funding?
I think I'm sure you all know there's been a lot of chaos and a lot of changes and panic right from the beginning of this year in regards to federal grant funding. And honestly, I think we're still just letting the dust settle, although some people unfortunately have had their grants canceled, but there have been a lot of changes that have been proposed. But I think we're all, still trying to see what's actually going to be implemented. I think a few things to keep in mind at this point is that it's not a lot of the changes are specific to agencies and programs. So it's not that there's been, an overall cut in the budget overall. You'll find that if you look more in detail at specific programs or agencies, some of them, the budget is pretty similar to previous years, and then some of them have been cut drastically. But in general, I think you've all seen that, a lot of proposals are being scrutinized for any DEI emphasis, and also foreign involvement seems to be a hot button right now. Although unfortunately, it's not really clear what exactly that means and what's going to throw up a red flag. But yeah, other than that, things are still changing. Things can change quickly. Solicitations are being updated frequently. In the past, I would, download the latest instructions, a couple months before preparing proposal, but you need to keep checking. I think, Idong and I were just talking before everyone logged on. I think as of end of March, you'll see a banner at the top of the latest NIH SBIR RFA saying the RFA has been updated to align with current policies. So that's something you will all need to keep in mind. Things are changing, and you need to keep checking the RFAs when you're applying.
Yes. So I'll second what Nao just said. And it's really important, really keeping. So I would say, in line of what you said, let's just remember that nothing has stopped completely. So there's still opportunities out there, and as long as those opportunities are out there, my recommendation to the clients that I've worked with have been just that you continue to go after the opportunities. You continue to pursue them until you're told to stop, right? Either it's pulled off, that it's no longer open, or that it's being paused. But right now, I checked a couple of the sites. Even APA, when I looked 2 days ago, they didn't have anything that was open. But right now, I just noticed they've put up another grant opportunity, another funding opportunity. So there's now 2 that are open versus 1 when I looked 2 days before. So it's a fluid environment. And so the recommendation is just to keep searching and keep your eyes on those agencies that align with the products that you're developing, to continue to look at those funding opportunities and jump on them as they open up.
So basically, there is a lot of fluidity, and we have to be vigilant about looking for opportunities. But also, it's important for us to read the proposals, the solicitations very clearly, because the guidelines that we are used to in the past might be different now.
Yes. And to just add to that, I had a client that I was working with who was in the process of, I was helping them on an application that they were working on. And halfway along, just towards the end, when they were about to submit, they reread the RFP and found out that the particular program that they were applying for had just been paused. And so that's why it's important to keep looking, not just at that it's open, but looking at the specific instructions.
Yeah, be attention to detail, read everything very, very clearly.
Yes.
So there were a couple of questions that came in, I think, which are relevant to this discussion. So I am going to put them in. So is there a central location where people can look for all the grants that are available?
So so it's grants.gov is supposed to be the central location. All government funding opportunities that are grants are supposed to be there. For contracts, it's US Gov. Okay, wait, I have to look up the contract one. It's not right off the top of my tongue. Unless you have it now, I'll look it up. But grants.gov is where all the grants are supposed to be. But we'll talk more as we go into the session about the specificity around individual programs and navigating that. So just searching grants.gov is not always as easy as it sounds like it should be.
So let's get into that. Nao, why don't you kick us off by walking us through the SBIR STTR landscape? You've had extensive experience in this space. Tell us about how somebody can navigate the SBIR STTR landscape.
Yes, so the SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, whereas STTR stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. So these are often called America's Seed Fund. So these are research grants from the federal government for small businesses in the U.S. It's available from currently available from 12 government agencies. So that includes NIH, NSF, Department of Defense, Department of Education, NASA, FDA, and so on. So I mentioned these are research grants. So these are for to develop technologies that still require some R&D to overcome some kind of risk or challenge in order to before they can be commercialized as a product. So for example, you're trying to demonstrate the feasibility of the core technology in a way that will be useful to your target customers. And SBIRs and STTRs come in several different phases. Phases 1 and 2 are the big ones that you'll most likely encounter. So phase 1, so the amount of funding for each phase and the duration of the project that varies depending on the agency, and sometimes there are exceptions. You can go over budget for certain topics, but generally phase 1, it's around $250,000 to $300,000, and the goal is usually to show the feasibility or technical merit and the commercial potential of your innovation. And then that's followed by phase 2, which is currently around $1 to $2 million, depending on the agency. And the goal is to continue the R&D that you started in phase 1, further develop the product, and prepare to attract further funding for commercialization. Also, SBIR, so the SBIR and STTR, you may be wondering what the difference is. So the SBIR, so the differences are mostly administrative. For an SBIR, you can partner with an research institution, and then with the STTR, you must partner with a research institution. And so the way the budget's distributed between the small business and an outside entity is a little different. So it's just administrative differences, but essentially these are R&D grants to developing a technology, and it's for U.S. small businesses.
Right, thank you. Idong, since I'm assuming that there are grants beyond SBIR and STTR, right, that are small businesses and startups can tap into. Can you walk us through a little bit of grants that are beyond SBIR and STTR?
Yes, definitely. So to start off on this, it's to remember that with SBIR, STTR, it's really been streamlined, and it's kind of a little bit easier to find the information everywhere because there's the seed.gov website that they've kind of tried to bring all the information together. Now, for other types of grants and fundings, it takes a little bit more work. I did put in the grants.gov link to somebody that asked in there, but it gets a little bit more complicated. It's more program specific. It's more agency specific. So you kind of have to know what you're looking at. So I'll highlight a couple of agencies that have opportunities beyond outside of the SBIR. So a lot of these have SBIRs, but they also fund other programs. So I'll highlight, first of all, everybody knows it as BARDA because it's a really long name. The I think it's Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. There's also APA-H, which is fairly new. I think they're getting maybe like about 2 years old now. APA-H is like the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services version of DARPA, which is DOD. So these agencies have specific funding opportunities that most of them advertise mostly through their website. So for instance, with BARDA, they have what they call their Easy BAA process. So they use this, BAAs are broad agency announcements. So they'll put out a topic and say, we're interested in this topic, solutions in this topic. And so this is where, as a founder, you have to look at, if I'm building a medical device for a specific area, does it fit in these topics? The DOD does the same thing. They have specific topics that they advertise funding opportunities for, typically also through BAAs. And they have, it's a specific topic. They have specific things that they want to see happen as part of that. And then the other one is there's another DoD program called the CDMRP. It's congressionally directed medical research program. So they also do a lot of disease-specific grants. And the other thing to note too is that with a lot of these agencies, and of course the NSF, which we all, I hope you're familiar with as well, because they're almost as popular as the NIH when it comes to grants. They also have other grants that are funded by specific programs within NSF that are not SBIR or STTR. The key thing to remember here is that with those program-specific funding opportunities, they usually have different kinds of requirements. So some will be like, they will do clinical trials, some are no clinical trials, some require that, you know, it has to be, for a lot of the DoD ones, they have to be military relevant. So either it's going to serve active duty, you know, military, or it's going to serve family members. But the key thing to remember with all of those is that your solution has to kind of tie into the mission of that specific program, because they are looking to advance or make progress on those programs. And so your solution has to be helping them get there.
So Idong, you mentioned, so Nao mentioned that the SBIR, SCTR grants are more for research purposes to help with the startup spin out. Some of the grant funding that you discussed, is that also for research purposes, or can the startup be further along for these grant fundings? And I also wanted to ask you, what about foundations?
Yes. So I'll start with the first one first. So yes, they're not always research focused. I think the NIH is really known for research focused grant opportunities, but even the NIH itself also funds companies that are much further along, because NIH funds clinical trials. And they also have, even with the SBIRs, there's the beyond phase 2. DoD, I think I forget which of the particular agencies actually has a phase 3, a very limited phase 3, but they all now have a component that deals with commercialization. And so companies can apply at different stages to the various agencies. And then to your question about foundations, yes, foundations are an important place for people to, as we start to look at diversifying funding sources in the current environment, foundations are definitely a good one to look at as well. I have had clients that I've worked with that wanted to look beyond federal funding sources, and were able to find grant opportunities. We think about the big like disease-focused groups. If you think about the American Medical, not the Medical Association, but like, you know, disease, like the groups that focus on hepatitis or focus on diabetes, a lot of them have grants, like early stage grants. Some of them might require that a company partners with the university because they have that requirement that the PI is from an academic institution. But these are the things that we'll talk about as we are talking more today, that there are ways to find ways that make yourself more competitive for these.
Yeah. And I've also heard a little bit about contracts. So government agencies also do contracts now, which are different from grants. Can you talk a little bit about what are contracts and how are they different from grants?
Yes. So DoD and BARDA are some of them that like to do contracts. And the difference between grants and contracts, the biggest one is that with contracts, it's really specifically milestone based. Your funding, like how you get funded or how you receive your payments in the course of the work, is usually milestone driven. And it's like almost like you're legally bound to deliver on the product that you are agreeing to. So for instance, you know, there's some agencies that will do even what we would consider like research work, where you're, you know, doing maybe animal work or something. Sorry about that. And they will require, like they'll have key milestones that you get paid as you reach those milestones. And DoD is the one that really is really bigger on that area of using contracts for a lot of their work. So it's just remembering, and then there's more engagement from the government with contracts, because you have contract officers who are responsible for ensuring that they work with your program officer to monitor your milestones and authorize your payments as you go along. So it's just a bit more like more deliverable focused and more timeline bound when it comes to contracts.
And are contracts non-dilutive as well?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so contracts are so the funding is in the form of what a VC funding would be, which is milestone based, but it's completely non-dilutive.
Yes, completely non-dilutive. And then there's a third one that's called the OTAs. So other transactional agreements, and Barter and Upper H tend to use that more. And that one allows them, so also a lot of emphasis on milestones and timelines, but it also allows a lot more engagement by the program officer. So the government program officer is going to be intimately involved with what you're doing, agreeing on what those milestones should be, and how you're assessing them and monitoring them over time. So you tend to do more meetings with the government when you have those other types of funding.
Wonderful. This is great information. So when does a startup know that it's ready for a grant? When should a startup start thinking about applying for a grant?
I think in terms of an SBI or an STTR, in order to apply, the company has to be legally incorporated. So that's one thing. But also, especially at phase one SBI or STTR, these are designed for early stage startups or early stage projects in a small business. And so it's not, don't assume that it's, you have to be generating revenue or, be far along or anything like that. That said, you'll need to be very clear about what you're planning to, what research projects you're planning to propose, why that's going to help you on your path to commercialization. And you should be able to very clearly, be very specific about your research plans and your deliverables, including a lot of reviewers like these quantitative metrics that'll make it very clear if you've been able to reach a milestone or not. In terms of preliminary data, again, it depends on the agency, even programs within a specific agency. Some of them prefer more preliminary data than others. But it is some kind of preliminary data or background research is very useful. Even when an opportunity says that you don't need preliminary data, you're probably competing against other proposals that have some preliminary data or background research. It doesn't even have to be that, you collected preliminary data, but you should have at least done the background research, looked at what's been done in the field so far, to back up that, your research is likely to, turn out you're able to test a certain hypothesis, and that your research project is going to be worthwhile. The other thing is for these commercialization-oriented grants, you want to make sure that you've carefully thought about the commercialization plan and that you're able to describe it in specific details, and you're able to back it up with either secondary, market research or some kind of customer validation. Yeah, that should not be overlooked just because it's an R&D grant.
So, Neo, I've heard that now with SBIR grants, they are looking for more customer validation as well. Like they want startups to have at least done the NSF I-Core. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So while it's not it's explicitly stated that it's a requirement or even a recommendation, I've been in several review panels for the NSF SBIR, so that is something the reviewers definitely bring up over and over again. So they want to see that you've validated your idea with customers in some way, and that it's not just theoretical or that you're assuming that customers would want your product. So it's really attractive to have done the NSF I-Core program, especially if you're applying for the NSF and NSF opportunity. That is something that reviewers do notice and pay attention to.
Yeah. Idong, what about you? What about non-SBIR grants? When should startups think about applying for those?
So that's a great question. So it does vary based on which agency and which program, right? So some, like the NSF, you think about NSF, they do early stage, they do fund in early stages. When you start getting into the Barters and the Uppers, they tend to want to at least have an MVP. It tends to be more of testing out of an MVP. I think about a lot of the DoD programs. You have a product that you are testing out in the population, or that you are part of the funding to kind of helps you get through the regulatory process. We have a number of companies that BARDA has supported, that they had an early stage prototype, and then they were able to get it through all the levels, the studies, and everything that was required to get it to FDA approval. And so the stages vary, and that's why, once again, looking at the requirements in those RFPs, in those announcements, is critical. So you can see what the requirements are, but it does vary, and it's, you know, and another point I wanted to raise, kind of adding up to what Nao had said, something that people underestimate is the registrations into government systems. So it's not like you can just get up and write a grant application and just mail it in. Most of these organizations have their own entry points for applications. So usually you need to sign on to a platform. You need to be registered in that platform. Some require that, you know, certain people in certain roles have to be registered in the system in those roles. So making sure that you put time out for that. And then, you know, you have to be registered in sam.gov and a couple of these other places. And you cannot submit your grant application without having those things in place. So if you're even thinking about applying for a grant or, you know, a contract, you should make sure that you get those registrations out of the way. And most of them are one-time things. So it's not like you have to worry about, you know, paying for it when you are not using it. But it's numbers and registrations that you have that are just on the back, and you pull them up when you need to go after one of these opportunities.
How long do these registrations typically take? When should startups start planning for that?
Idong mentioned SAM registration. So this is where you register your company on this website called which is sam.gov in order to apply for federal funding from the federal government. So this is the one that I suggest all companies start with. It can take at least 2 months. And that they're not kidding. And there's really nothing you can do about it. And if you submit your registration, there's something wrong with it, you're gonna have to start over. I have missed a deadline because of a SAM registration issue. I've called them and jumped up and down. There's really nothing you can do about it. So at least 2 months in advance. A lot of the registrations will follow from that. And some of them, you know, it's instantaneous, but for example, if you're applying for an NIH grant, you would need to register in it's a platform called ERA Commons. That can take, I've seen it take anywhere from 1 day to 2 weeks to get your company registered. So some of these things take quite a while.
And after a company applies for a grant, how long before they'll actually see the money? What is the timeline that a company should be preparing for?
So I'll jump in and then let Nao go. So once again with mine, because we're talking about multiple agencies and multiple programs, it can vary. Some have really expedited ways of, you know, getting submissions in. So I think of like BARDA. BARDA lets you submit. You can actually request a meeting, which is very unusual. You can actually request a meeting. There's a form on their website. I'm blanking on the name. It's called a Tech Watch meeting. There we go. So it's called a Tech Watch meeting. You go on the website, you select which program, you know, you think your solution is relevant to, and you give them a one-pager about your technology, and they will look at it and they'll get back to you. And that usually that turnaround for them, it's about within a month, within a few weeks, you typically get a response, and they'll tell you whether they're interested or not, which I always tell companies, you definitely want to do that, because you don't want to be expending time and resources if it's not going to be a match, right? It's still very early, but at least it gives you a sense of if there's any interest or not. Now, once you've submitted your application, so if some of them, most organizations do it in phases. They'll do that initial meeting, and then there's you do like a summary, and before you submit the full project, the full application. So it's a few months. I think I would say anywhere from 1 to 3 months to get your applications together and submitted. Now, once you hear back, the review also varies. I think the NIH now can talk about their timelines more. Some get back to you fairly quickly. Like I said, BARDA and APRA tend to be on the quicker ends of the spectrum. So within a couple of weeks, you hear back. And then if they say yes, and you're going to be awarded, you don't get the money right away, of course. There's a negotiation period, particularly if it's a contract. You have to have a negotiation with the government to agree on the final terms of the contracts and all of that. And then it takes another couple of months before you get the money. So you could say anywhere from 3 to 6 months from when you find out that you have been approved to, or like, your project has been accepted.
Yeah. And then I assume it's similar for SBIRs as well, timeline-wise?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of preparation, so again, start at least 2 months in advance, especially if you're starting from scratch, you have to register your companies. But also if you're working with a research institution and you're planning to give them a subaward, that can take extra time as well, because research institutions tend to have their own internal deadline before the actual deadline. So they have time to do their own administrative work to process the subaward and fill out and then complete all the administrative forms and so on. And so so at the very least start 2 months in advance, and then it's still pretty tight. And then after you submit, I would say at least 6 months until you see money in your bank account, if you're lucky. It usually takes a lot longer, because after you submit, you have to wait for the review panel for the reviewers to look at your proposal. The review panel meets, they discuss it, they score it, and they'll rank the proposals that they're looking at in that panel. And then it goes through, additional administrative hurdles. But yeah, so essentially, so if you are, if it looks promising, after you submit and it gets reviewed, you're probably going to spend a bit of time answering additional questions from the funding agency. And then there's going to be, more paperwork. And then you'll finally, once you've completed all of that, then you'll be able to get the money in your bank account. So I would say 6 months if you're lucky, but I've seen it take a lot longer, especially recently. There's just, with a lot of staffing changes at these government agencies, and then the review panels were paused for a bit and then resumed, and so expect delays, especially right now.
And can a company apply to more than one agency for the same concept?
You can. So if you're applying for an SBIR or an STTR, there's usually a box you can check in the submission form. Say it'll ask, are you submitting the same project, or some parts of this this project to other federal agencies, and you can check yes or no. So you can apply. However, if you get multiple awards for the same project, you can only accept one of them. You cannot double dip.
Idong, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So yes, no, she is right about that. That you can apply to multiple agencies. Actually, companies who've successfully done this, who've gotten millions of dollars in developing their products from a couple of them that I saw recently got money from early stage money from DoD, and then they were able to transition and get money from BARDA for the next 2 rounds before they actually went out and raised money from private markets. But yes, you can apply to multiple agencies, but you have to think about that whole thing about your strategy, right? Of what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And what I've seen some organizations do too is they kind of parse out the work, like break it up and go after funding on certain pieces with certain agencies, and then, do others with other agencies, just matching. Because the key thing here is matching to mission, right? Making sure that what you're proposing, the stage of what you're proposing, fits with what that agency is looking for. And so that, that can work.
Yeah. And what is the typical success rate of a grant?
So yeah, I mean, grant success rates vary. I think in the early stages, if you think about things like, the NIH phase 1 grants and and even the earlier stage grants that others like NSF do, they range anywhere from 20 to 30, 35% is the numbers I've seen them share. And then when you get to phase two, normally phase twos tend to be follow on. You already got a phase one. I've seen companies that got a phase one from NSF and then they got a phase two from NIH. And I just lost my chain of thought. But sorry. So I mean, so they would get, you know, different phases from different agencies, but it's still able. I'm sorry, I forgot where I was going with my answer. What was your question?
The question was, what is the rate of success?
The rate, yes. So that's what I was going to say. So the success rates actually get better the further along you go because the pool is smaller. You know, usually for phase two, most agencies require that you have to have had a phase one. And so the pool of your, you know, who you're competing again is smaller. And then also the government now knows who you are, right?
Yeah.
There's a bit more familiarity with your work. And so your chances of success are higher. And this is one of the reasons why I always encourage companies to apply. Don't expect to get the first grant you apply for because nobody know, you know, the government doesn't know who you are, right? But that interaction of getting that grant and getting that feedback, when you now reapply, there's a level of familiarity because a lot of times those review groups tend to be the same ones that are reviewing in those sections. And so it's important to get yourself out there, you know, get that application out there because on the subsequent rounds, your success rates actually increase.
Yeah, very well said. It's important to establish credibility. So you guys have worked with a lot of different grants. You've seen a lot of different grants. In your opinion, what do companies that are very successful with grants, what do they do well? What's their secret sauce? What makes them successful?
I think you know, when I've worked with SBIR and STTRs, a few things. So I think you know, understanding the level of rigor that's required for the research plans. You know, so you know, and if someone's from, you know, a research background, you know, they're very good with that. But when someone is not from a research background, you know, they're not always familiar with, you know, the level of rigor you need for, you know, the statistical analyses or the, you know, the quantitative milestones or, you know, how you're supposed to defend the methods you're using and so on. And so it's very important to have the details figured out when you apply. You know, some people think that, you know, oh, you get the money and then you figure out the details. No, you have to have the details figured out before you apply. And then also, you know, I think making sure that you're taking the commercialization plan seriously, and you know, having some, you know, like we mentioned earlier, having actual customer validation. So you know, the commercialization pathway is it's not meant to be theoretical. It's something that you should be prepared to implement. And so I think, especially if someone's from a research background, it's important to remember that if you're applying for a grant that's specifically designed for to aim for commercialization, you know, no amount of amazing technical details is going to make up for a lack of a, you know, good commercialization plan. So I think those are a couple of things I've seen, but also, you know, making sure to tailor the proposal to that particular funding agency or funding opportunity, because they do have different goals and priorities. So you can't just take, you know, your NIH proposal and then just copy paste it into an NSF format, even if it's, you know, essentially, you know, the same research project. You really do need to tailor it properly to each agency and opportunity.
So Neo, Idong mentioned a little bit about talking, you know, submitting a one-pager for BARDA. Can startups do the same for SBIR, STTRs as well? Can they interact with the program officer?
Yes, so each agency does it a little differently. But for example, right now the NSF is requesting a project pitch, which I think is it's an online form, but essentially maybe it amounts to around 1 to 2 pages. basically describing, giving summaries of what you're proposing, and you submit that, and then one of the program managers will come back and say, no, this is not of interest, or they'll have questions, or they'll say, yes, this is within our scope. Please submit a full proposal. So that's I think that's a relatively new thing that I think is really good, because you can really you can do this and get some feedback before you go ahead and spend a lot of hours on a proposal. For the NIH and I think other agencies, you can also talk to the program officer there. So for example, at the NIH, there's usually a program officer assigned to each of the NIH institutes within the NIH, who's assigned to deal with the SBIRs and STTRs. And I highly recommend contacting them well in advance of the deadline. They'll usually request the one-page specific aims page for your proposal, where you essentially summarize, the background, what your company's trying to do, and the specific aims of the research project. And then they'll be able to tell you, this is of interest to our institute, or they may say, no, but try these other institutes. And I think that's it's really important to try to talk to a human at the funding agency if you can, because they will know, what the current priorities are and what they're looking for, what they've seen funded recently from that agency. And these things are unfortunately not always obvious from the instructions or the website. And then the funding agency's priorities change from year to year. And so it's really, really helpful to talk to an actual human if you can.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you, Nao. Idong, do you have anything else to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so I was going to say, in terms of the things that help teams, position themselves for success, I use the word teams, and yes, teams. You have to think about who you're proposing to do the work. Because I think about even on the investor side, it's a big thing that investors are always worried about, is who's on your team. Do they have the capacity to deliver and execute? It's the same thing with the government grants and contracts and all those opportunities. They want to know that you have the capacity to execute. And if you're a small company, I think I saw somebody post, ask about, if you're a smaller company, just one or two people, think about partnering, right? Think about partnering, particularly for the research-focused grants like the NIH ones. See if you can partner with a university. See if you can partner with a nonprofit. Like think through how you can, meet those goals. The other thing I would want to mention is budget. We tend to not think a lot about that as scientists when we're putting these things forward. But it's just as investors think about budget, they want to know what your runway is like. The government also wants to know, with the grant, with the budget, what is it that you're going to spend and how is it relevant to moving the project forward? Because they want to be sure that the dollars that they're giving you are focused on getting this product to the next stage and accomplishing the milestones, and that you're not using it for other things, right? And so it's important to think through that budget. Start with the big number and back it up into months, into weeks, and match them to your milestones. And then finally, I'll mention, talking about milestones, make sure those milestones are realistic. Like, if you're applying for a 1-year grant, what is feasible for you to do in 1 year? Because we talked about impressions and creating a reputation. You don't want to promise that you can do X, Y, Z, and then the end of the year, you're nowhere close. It doesn't make you attractive for follow-on funding. And a lot of times, that initial funding, think about it as the thing that opens the door for you. So you want to make sure that you're able to deliver on the milestones that you promise, so that when you apply for more funding, it's easier for the government to say yes.
Yeah. So effectively, make sure that you have the right product, make sure the product is well aligned with the agency's requirements, make sure you have a good commercialization strategy, you have a good team in place, and your budget is well aligned with the proposal that you're proposing. So lastly, do you know of anything that is on the horizon, any grant proposals that are on the horizon that companies should start preparing for, something that's coming up in the next 6 months?
Yes. So Actually, I wanted to take the opportunity to announce that Fehmida and I will be running a series of workshops to guide you through the NIH SBIR Phase 1 proposal and aiming. So we'll start in early July, and we are aiming for the September 5th deadline. So keep your eye out for that.
And we will be sending you out more information about that. Idong, anything on the other agencies that's on the horizon? You mentioned ARPA-H. Anything else?
Yeah, so ARPA-H has some announcements. Like I said, they have 2 opportunities that are open right now. BARDA they still have their Easy BAA announcement out, but it's the individual project areas that are different. And so, what we do, and so there's a question in the chat as well from Ronaldo. So what we do at the Idyeas Group is working with companies that want to go after these opportunities and really help them, go figure out the maze, because it does take time and it does take familiarity to know like what's a good opportunity for an early stage company versus one that has a product that has already started part of the regulatory process. Like there's some expertise that goes into figuring those things out. And so we're always available to help. And to address Ronaldo's question, some of these opportunities are open to non-US companies as well. I know that always surprises people when they hear it, but there are opportunities that are available, non-dilutive funding opportunities that are available for non-US companies. And so I would say, access resources like what Amplify MedTech offers and the people that you've heard from in this room to help you navigate those, navigate the landscape and figure out what the match is for you.
Yeah, and also partnering with a university in the US would be a great way to tap into some of these opportunities as well. The one thing that we did not touch on is state funding, right? So we are based in Maryland. We have an amazing organization called TEDCO here. A lot of TEDCO's investments tend to be equity based, but TEDCO also has some grant investments that are available. So I would also encourage you to look at what funding is available from your state to help you and support you with the startup that you are building. So with that, I would really like to thank Nao and Idong for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. We will open it up for questions if you have any.